I do want to welcome everybody. I'm looking at the attendees. It's incredible. People from all over the country, Canada, and we absolutely have a guest here from Zimbabwe, Africa. That's amazing. So thank you for joining us. Okay, I first had the opportunity to listen to Steve Gans give a speech at the U.S. Soccer AGM maybe 3 years ago when he had put his hat in the ring to run as president of U.S. Soccer, and I was extremely impressed with the words that he spoke. And I actually had the opportunity to meet Steve last year at the club summit, and I thought his presentation was simply amazing. Steve is a partner at Prince Lobel and Tive, focusing on corporate sports and employment law, and he represents professional and youth soccer clubs in the United States and England. He's also a founder of Professional Soccer Advisors, a consulting firm working with pro and youth clubs and with corporations looking to become involved in the game. He played in the youth system for the New England T-Men and served as the NASL club's statistician and official scorer. He also played college soccer at Cornell and Brandeis, worked in the front office, and had a short stint playing with the Baltimore Blast, was formerly on the board of governors and general counsel for FC Boston, a U.S. Soccer Development Academy club. He also played a significant role in Boston's selection as World Cup host city in 1994. I would like at this time to introduce to you Mr. Steve Gans.
Thank you so much, Louise. I just want to correct for the record. I don't know where you got all that stuff. That you did some digging, but I didn't play for the New England T-Men first team. I was on their youth team. I was in college at the time. But I also want to say I'm not wearing a suit this year because you told me not to, Louise. So hopefully this is dressed down enough. Thank you so much. Really, it's great to be here. I enjoyed it so much last year in Florida. And as Louise says, too bad we're not together, but we're lucky that we're healthy, and so that we can do this. So thanks to Kwik Goal, thanks to the sponsors, We Got Soccer and Demisphere and all other sponsors for this. And hopefully next year we'll do this in person. Last year, I spoke for my whole 60 minutes because I was the first speaker and I knew we had 3 days and people could ask me questions, and I had so much to share with all of you. I have a lot to share with you this time too, but I'm going to keep this. In fact, here I go. I'm going to time it. I'm going to keep this to 45 minutes so that we can have 15 minutes of questions. And if there aren't questions, then I can go on and talk about some stuff that I'm going to skip today. But there are 57 pages in this PowerPoint, and I'm happy to share, and Kwik Goal will share with you if you want it. There are a lot of great tips in here, legally and operationally. As Louise says, the background, I've been a player, obviously a board member of a youth club. My perspective here is as a lawyer and as a board member and an advisor and as a parent. I have two kids who went through the club system who are currently college soccer players. And I advise players and parents, clubs, youth from youth college to pro, and hopefully you come away with this with some good legal and operational tips. I just want to note that the subject heading here differs a little from the marketing piece from Kwik Goal. What I'm talking about is COVID-19, what we've all been through, the lessons we can draw from it, and best practices moving forward. Tim, if you can move to slide 3, that would be great. Thank you. So what I want to do is to start by listing not all the matters I worked on in the game and in the sport. This is just a subset of them in 2020, but rather stuff in particular that was just COVID inspired, just stuff that arose because of COVID or became kind of hyper on steroids because of COVID. And not to list a resume here, but to sort of inform why it happened, what lessons we can draw from it. And I'm going to pick about 6 of these to talk about today and turn it into hopefully legal and operational tips for you. If you see anything on here that I don't talk about in substance, you can ask in the questions or follow up. So the first thing is not youth related, but I bring it up because it's linked. I'm currently working on the first and negotiating the first collective bargaining agreement in the history of the USL and the championship. And then after that, we'll do the League One. That's been a long, long process. But of course, what happened last year with COVID is that the league got suspended, and we spent 2 months negotiating the return to play provisions. And we're currently doing that. In fact, tomorrow I have a session doing that again for 2021, which obviously has some twists to it because now we have a vaccine. So there are going to be significantly different provisions in that. I advised the league and their youth league return to play guidelines as well, and also an adult state soccer association and its return to play guidelines. Now I list them again, not as a resume list, but rather to say, look how much this pervaded obviously our lives, but the sport. All three of these, while it had some fundamental aspects to it, which were the same, very much had different twists to them as well, all encompassing this issue. A fourth thing I worked on is an league investigation on behalf of a league related to a club v. club alleged ethics violation claim that, really largely, I think, rose because of COVID. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I did an investigation on behalf of a club related to inappropriate social media behavior of a coach. I'm always called on to do coaching contracts and employment agreements. Last year, very much more so because of the turmoil everybody was in and everyone trying to sort of get matters in place. Something I don't always do. I represented clubs in their relationships dealing with landlords because suddenly they had, for facilities and otherwise for fields, they had monies due, and in some cases they couldn't pay them or they wanted relief. Tim, next slide, please. Also, relationship with tenants and subtenants. If you lease a facility or own a facility, you might have a right to be a sub-landlord. And so suddenly the shoe was on the other foot. So we had to deal with how to deal with subtenants who were in the same position. 9 and 10 talks about cease and desist letters. Don't always get called upon for those, but last year I did a lot. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in principle. Why should they arise at all? Why should I even be necessary? And they related to, coach recruitment and defection issues not happening the right way. And in one case, administrator taking confidential information away from a club. Did a lot of drafting of amended and restated bylaws because, again, clubs want to get their house in order, and also because of making sure that the organization is legally protected, and something called piercing the corporate veil could never happen. Worked on league pass card release and recruitment rules because of, again, all the movement. Certainly worked on, as always, some transactions, but in particular, I'm going to talk about transactions between a for-profit and a nonprofit because it's very, very prevalent in the youth space and is very complicated. And there are important rules that have to be followed. And then you see the next one is a transaction with a for-profit with a question mark. And what I'm going to talk about there is a situation where a club, the target club, is nominally a for-profit, but the buyer can't, but it was formerly a nonprofit, and the buyer can't 100% establish that it was converted properly or that the assets were transferred properly. These are major traps for the unwary. One more page, Tim, thanks. Refund policies. I'm sure you all were put in the position when you had to stop your activities, you had to come up with a policy that gave credits or refunds. And despite your best efforts, some people weren't happy and made complaints. And I had to represent a number of clubs, related to complaints to the consumer departments of attorney general areas. And if anyone has a question, I'm not going to talk about that today, but I can tell you how it was handled. Employment matters within COVID, obviously. My employment partners, most of them had never even dealt with a furlough, and yet that became very big last year. Also, HIPAA privacy issues in medicine. And then with the DA collapse, obviously, that turned everything into turmoil and helped clubs with entry into other leagues. And lastly, some of you, I'm sure, got PPP loans. Tim, we can go on to the next slide. So it just shows the kind of enormous effect. I look at all 18 of those matters as largely influenced by COVID. So one of the things I get called upon a lot normally, and very much so last year, are coaching agreements. And I've come up with model agreements that I tweak for clubs. And, essentially, there are 3 versions in my view. The first version is a coaching agreement for a coach. In other words, a club retains a coach just to coach a team or 2 or 3. The next one is a coaching for a coach who also has some management and some director level possibly responsibility. And the third one is a more significant agreement for a DOC or an EDOC or someone with significant responsibility in the organization. So there are, next slide, Tim. So just to quickly go over those, the general agreement is maybe a 2 or 3 page agreement, depending on what the club wants in it, tweaking my model. It has exhibits, usually having the duties and responsibilities of the coach, as well as the rules and procedures of the club that the club coach has to follow. It's usually an at-will agreement, and what that means is that a club can terminate a coach for any reason or no reason at all, so long as it's not discriminatory or against public policy. And built into it is a provision where the coach agrees that they're not going to take confidential information of the club while an employee or after leaving, and a non-solicitation agreement provision, meaning that they won't solicit sponsors, other coaches, employees, or players if they move to another club. Now, one thing I do want to talk about the non-solicitation, because I'm going to skip part of the DOC presentation and I'll go back to it if we have time. I want to distinguish for a minute non-competition provisions from non-solicitation provisions. Non-competition is something that is hard to enforce in the normal course. Some states like California don't allow non-competition provisions. And even if they are enforceable, it's always unclear whether a court will enforce a non-competition provision because they're really balancing some essential rights. The club's essential right to protect its legitimate business interests, but the coach's legitimate right and essential right to work. And so even if you have one in place, it's not always clear whether they can be enforceable. In Massachusetts, and I talked about this last year, there's a new law. We're maybe the only state in the country that came up with a new law based on an English law that guarantees it will be enforceable, a non-competition agreement, a non-competition provision for 1 year. All non-competition agreements have to be reasonable in terms of length, scope of activity, length of time, and territory. And Massachusetts says now that you can, if you jump through some hoops, you can absolutely enforce your non-competition agreement. But there's a heavy price to it. And that heavy price is that you have to give, in this case, let's say the DOC, what's called garden leave, based on an English old law and current law, which essentially is at least 6 months of salary. What you're saying is, look, we need you to sit out for the year if you leave, and you agree to a non-competition agreement, but we can't just enforce it without giving you considerable consideration, considerable recompense for that. And again, it's a minimum 6 months in Massachusetts. The larger point is that, my advice usually, given that uneven landscape, is that you only, as a club, go for non-competition provision in the most significant relationships wherein the coach is heavily remunerated, where the coach is intimately involved with all of the operations, and where if a coach left suddenly or otherwise, there could be major impact uh, as to the club. So we can move on to the next one. Same thing, coaching with management director level. Those are generally about 3 to 4 pages. They have a little more in it. Same types of exhibits. The difference is there's usually a stated term in there. And what that means is that converts the agreement into a bit of an employment contract if it has a stated term. So you have to literally state that the agreement is at will, and you likely might have termination provisions in there as well. It makes it a little more significant. Same type of confidential information and non-solicitation provisions in there. The only thing I'd like to add about the 3 to 4 page one is coaching with someone who's at management level is that someone at that type of level, director level, let's say the head of your MLS Next program or otherwise running big regions, you could choose to, they might have the leverage to have an agreement that's more of a full-on DOC type of agreement, a larger one that we'll get to in the next slide now. So the DOC agreements are generally, again, there's a model for that, but obviously it's bespoke in some ways. 6 to 8 pages, similar exhibits, maybe a little more in the exhibits. The main point is it's a full-on employment agreement contract, and therefore you have to have much more in terms of what's in it, in terms of for cause definitions for termination within the term. I will argue that you should also have without cause termination provisions in there, but if you do that, you make sure that the DOC gets good compensation for that if the club is going to try to terminate the contract midstream. Last year, I spoke a little bit about this. There are about 8 slides in here with really significant information in here. If we don't get back to that today, because I really want to talk about some other stuff, and I talked about it last year, please avail yourselves of these slides because they can be really helpful. I do want to go on, if you can go on to the 11th slide, that'd be great, thanks. So one thing just in approaching a DOC employment agreement, you want to make the term a reasonable one. I say no less than 1 year, no more than 3 years in these contracts because they are full-on contracts. Why no more than 3 years? Because relationships can become stale. The club might feel it needs to move in another direction. 3 years, I think, is reasonable and fair to both sides. And it's important to do that absent exceptional circumstances. So duties and responsibilities and time commitment expectations, it's essential that you have them in there. DOCs come with other endeavors in their background and sometimes become so well known in their communities that they get opportunities locally and nationally. And so that's okay if you approve it and they disclose it, but it's not okay if it's in conflict with the club, and it's not okay if it diminishes their ability to work full time for the club. So you need to put that stuff in there. In terms of salary, if you're a nonprofit, IRS makes clear that it has to be reasonable compensation, and that's not just a term of art. That means you have to source other coaches who get similar salaries in a comparable club. And it's always important, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, to have a compensation committee. And the DOC should absolutely be recused if the DOC is on the board, other than maybe making a case for him or herself, to be recused from any of those deliberations. So slides 12, 13, 14, we're going to move past those for now because I did them last year and you can have them. They're tweaked a little. We're going to move to 17. But again, those, we'll get back to them if we can, but those really they're chock full of tips in how to draft a full unemployment agreement for your DOC and senior people. So I've never talked about this before, but we're going to talk about a social media policy. And the reason, I certainly believe everyone should have one. I don't know how many of you do, but you should. But the reason I'm talking about it this year is because one of the investigations I had to do related, was for a club, and it related to inappropriate social media, alleged inappropriate social media messages sent by a coach to an underage player. And I got that call, late at night. We were away for a couple of days in Vermont. I live in Boston, but it's something that I had to jump on right away. This was potentially existential for the club. Not that it should matter, because what was alleged was not a good fact scenario, but in this case, not that it should matter, but the parents of the child were prominent people who also had ties in the judicial system. And so the need for proper handling of this, which was of course there no matter who the parties were, was even heightened. It underscores the need for a policy. It underscores the need for a prompt and proper response. And I'm proud to say that the club did everything right. We conducted a fast but thorough investigation. We came up with remedies, a conclusion and remedies, and everybody involved was satisfied with how that went. And that club, can look at it in the rearview mirror right now, but it was a cautionary tale. And of course, that club has social media policies now. There always should be a social media policy for coaches. There, in my mind, there should be one for players as well, and maybe not in the sense of how clubs have it. We'll get to that in a minute. If we can go on to 18, Tim. So what should you have in your social media policy? First of all, the social media policy as to coaches, it should extend to communications, not just social media activity, but communications. The policy behind it is to preserve player safety. It's to preserve the club's reputation. Coaches should not be using private channels or using direct messaging to the extent they use social media or texting in terms of communication. It should be open and to the group. Texting should only include practice and game logistics. Text and email should only be soccer related, and a club might consider, although some might think it overkill, that parents be copied on all of that. Should your coach allowed to be Facebook friends with your kid? I'm not coming down on a position here, but it is an issue. Commonly that does occur. Is that by itself harmful? Not necessarily. It depends what elements you want to have in your policy. And then over and above the responsibility to the kids and the players, the coaches have responsibility to the club. And I think it's important to have in your policy that any personal or political statements are made by a coach on their personal accounts with their own contact info, and with a disclaimer that their opinions are their own and not anyone else's or organizations. Some clubs also go so as far as to have photos and videos they might upload on the Facebook page of the club or otherwise to get parent consent. So let's go on to players. So I'm going to talk to you about a case study here that actually didn't happen within COVID, but I think it's relevant since we're talking about social media. It happened a couple of years ago, and it informs my view of what the policy should be for kids. I think there should be a policy relating to kids. And the reality is that most clubs, if they have a social media policy for the players, it's really more about player safety guidelines. And that absolutely should be the case here. But I think there should be more. And so again, I think all clubs should have a player policy. In this case, what occurred a couple of years ago, it might have been 3 years ago now, is is a male player for a club came to a practice, and before a practice showed inappropriate pictures and messages about a female classmate of his to all of his teammates on the sideline while they were warming up. And suddenly I got a call late at night, and suddenly the club potentially had exposure and liability to someone in a family that they didn't even know. And that club did not have a social media policy in place at that time. It certainly does now. But again, a quick response and investigation was very much necessary. And I'm glad to say that the club handled that one as well. But it informed, and that was resolved favorably. But I'm pleased, to say that that worked out well. But it informs what I think is a very, very important part of policy for kids. So again, we can go on to the next one. There should be a part of it that's players' safety guidelines related. Generally, there should be no 1v1 email texting with the coach. No social media site conversations with the coach, certainly not direct messaging wise. The child should be advised to tell the parent or guardian about a message that they might get from a coach on non-soccer issues. So that's the part that's really about protection. But I think there's also an obligation that the kids have in the player agreement that they should agree to, and the club should incorporate this. There should be no posting of sexual, racist, or obscene material. No sharing, text or otherwise, of inappropriate material within the club. The example I was talking about that happened a few years ago. And there should be a pledge, an agreement from the player that no content online should be unsportsmanlike, derogatory, demeaning, or threatening to another individual or another party. So in my recommendation, the social media policy to players exceeds just player safety guidelines. One last slide on social media. The question is, should your club extend that to staff and volunteers? I think certainly yes to staff, and even if you have a parent player agreement, whether that should be extended to parents. I mean, at least that's a consideration. But again, a good few weeks of my summer was spent in investigating something here, and really was a extremely dicey situation. So my advice is that everyone should get a social media policy in place. Going to the next one. So again, I think there are lessons from another matter I worked on last summer that I think really only eventuated because of COVID. And that was an investigation on behalf of a league. So league retained us to do an investigation. And the reason I want to talk about this is kind of, it's sort of a cautionary tale. It's a story of no good deed goes unpunished. But I also want to talk about it for all you club leaders, because of course, why am I talking about a league? Who sits on a league board of directors? Well, it's you guys, right? Leaders of clubs make up the board of directors of leagues. So this is relevant for you. And one quick aside, part of my counseling in that kind of situation is what's really interesting in leagues is that there's a tension, right? So whether it's a pro league and you sit on a committee in the NFL, or whether it's a youth league, you're kind of like a team of rivals coming together. You could be friendly rivals, but you're coming together. And when you're acting as a member, as a representative of your club, and not as a board member, you can prosecute and chase after and prosecute the best interests of your club. But what's really important to know is if you sit on the board of directors of a club, of a league, and you are acting as a director, you have a fiduciary obligation to that league. So when you have that hat on, you have to think league first, not club first. And that's an inherent tension that needs to be reconciled constantly. In this case, this league is a really admirable league, and it came up with an admirable plan many years ago. aimed at recruiting rules and stopping, a lot of the chaos that disrupts the lives of the most important constituents, which are the kids. And here's the case study. I'm going to the next slide, Tim. Thanks. So the league has recruitment rules in place, and the rules involve essentially four different things. There's a prohibition on contacting players during the season, one club to another. If a player contacts a club, the quote new club needs to get permission from the current club to talk to that player. There's a prohibition on clubs acquiring entire teams, en masse. And there's a 12-month non-compete rule where a moving coach can't coach at the same age group. I say this is a no good deed goes unpunished situation because here are a little bit of the facts of this. In light of furloughs, in light of chaos, just because of COVID, coaches from one club move to another club. It's understandable, right? Coaches need to look out for their best interests. But the aggrieved club hired an attorney from a respected law firm, and the attorney, pursued this, which was his right, but he did it in a way that exploited the bylaws of this group. When I say exploited, found loopholes in it. The intention of the league was a noble one, and is a noble one, and that is to absolutely have fairness in recruitment and otherwise. But it had not laid out a process for disciplinary review and for investigation. And so what that lawyer did is he exploited that, and he kind of tried to make the league act like a legal tribunal, almost like a court. And so what ensued was many, many, many weeks of interviews of witnesses and parties, and many conversations with attorneys. We, again, were investigating for the league, and it turned into a long, protracted, costly exercise for the league. Ultimately, it was resolved. We submitted our report, and there was a resolution. The parties are both still in good standing. Part of that league obviously went on, and that was a situation now in the past. But the league then engaged us to do a bylaws update. And so what we did to make sure that nothing could happen in this manner is we created new rules. And if there's ever an ethics, the recruitment rules are still in place, but if there's ever an ethics complaint again, the way it's going to be handled is in a very circumscribed way. Both clubs can submit written material. There's going to be one hearing. There's one appeal right from a party that may not be happy with the ruling by the disciplinary review committee, and then there's a ruling from that, and it's over. So that, again, I don't think would have arisen but for COVID, and is another I think good lesson if you sit on these boards, and otherwise you can take lessons for your club. So let's move on. This is going to relate back to coaching contracts. So I was retained more than a few times last summer, or during the COVID period, related to the need to, or the request that we draft cease and desist letters related to coach movement. And what I want to say about coach movement is there is coach movement the right way, and there's coach movement the wrong way. And the first thing I want to say is when, coach wants to move or moves, there's a balancing of concerns and interests, right? Coach has a right to improve his or her job circumstances. The motivation is obviously to improve their life circumstances and their job. Another concern is the kids, which we'll get to, but that should always underlie everything. Another concern obviously is the club, the existing club at which the coach coaches. What becomes relevant, does the league have recruitment rules like this league had? Are no non-solicitation provisions in place? Can this be achieved with a movement without chaos and unintended consequences? And let's be honest for a minute about what new offer motivation is about, in most cases at least. in youth soccer. Um, it is not that when a new club makes an offer to a club, a coach at an old club, that motivation is not because that coach is the next Arsene Wenger or Jill Ellis, or because the club's going to suddenly win. Obviously they want good coaches, but let's be candid. It's in 99% of the cases, it's because there's a belief that that coach is going to bring players. And that underscores a lot of the tension here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, but the last thing I'd say about this is a balance of concerns and interests here. Players don't want to switch in most cases, right? If they're happy with their coach and they're happy with their club, they don't want to switch. So all of this movement puts pressure on kids, and we all have to keep in mind, we don't want kids to lose here. So this is really the list of the concerns and interests. Now let's move to the next slide, and let's talk about movement the right way and the wrong way. So here's movement the wrong way, okay? And we're assuming here that there's no non-compete in place where someone actually can be restricted from moving. And again, I absolutely champion a coach's right to move. Soccer America did an interview with me last year, and I talked a little bit about this stuff. And then there was a Twitter feed saying, "Oh, how I'm anti-coach." And I've represented NCAA coaches, pro coaches, and even advised youth coaches. I'm absolutely not anti-coach, and I've been a coach myself. I absolutely champion a coach's right to better his or her circumstances. I think what I would say is there's a right way and a wrong way. And what I should also add is there should be no reason why someone like me has to be or retained to write a cease and desist letter, particularly in youth soccer, as I'll get to in a minute. But why is it so controversial and why is it so rampant that there's a need for this? So here's movement the wrong way. You assume there's no non-compete so the coach can go. What's wrong is contacting players while you're still at the current club. One of the cease and desist letters I did related to a situation where a current coach at a club arranged a Zoom meeting using the current club's Zoom ID and address with all the parents and kids saying, "I'm going to be leaving such and such time. Will you all come with me?" Well, that's inappropriate. Using the current club's confidential information is inappropriate. If there's a non-solicit, if there's not a non-solicit, once you get to the new club, you can contact the kids. But if there's a non-solicit for a reasonable period, like 1 year, you're not supposed to contact them. And so here's my controversial comment here. And especially for those guys who put out that Twitter feed. This idea that there's restriction on coach movement, particularly in youth soccer, absent a non-compete provision, it's a myth in my opinion. And the reason it's a myth in youth soccer in particular is that, as we all know, there can be no restriction on player movement, right? This is a pay-to-play system. Kids can move whenever they want, generally. And the issue about pass cards and all that is a separate issue that I can address in questions or otherwise. But to be clear, kids can move, right? And so why is there all this chicanery in certain circumstances with a coach that's leaving? If a club believes a coach is going to bring players, if this coach is really liked and a good coach, if that coach is a Pied Piper, the kids will follow. So why is there a need for someone like me? And it's bad form. It's arguably illegal, depending on how they do it, and it's unethical. So let's talk about movement the right way. It all comes down to timing. Simple. Wait until you join the new club. Do not recruit while you're at the old club. Do not recruit at all if you have a non-solicit provision. If you're good, these are very insular communities, as we know, youth soccer. Word will travel. If you're good, if you're liked, the kids will follow. Don't contact parents, kids while still employed. Don't take the old club property, and don't solicit if prohibited. And to me, this is a whole aspect of youth soccer that that I'm called upon to work on a lot, but I truly don't understand. There's no reason for the controversy that constantly occurs. So that's my advice there. I do, of course, advise clubs for these reasons to have non-solicit provisions at a minimum. So let's move on to mergers and acquisitions and sales of assets, which I spoke about last year. And there are a lot of slides here that can help walk you through transactions. I do want to talk about a couple of things that I handled in COVID because it's really important, I think. So sometimes people come to me and they have a nonprofit and they say, I founded this club and it's time, I want to sell my stock. It's time for me to cash in. And I have to say, well, you don't have anything to sell. In other words, you have no stock to sell. As you know, a nonprofit is there are no stockholders, and if you will, colloquially, the stockholders are the public. You've created this as a charitable endeavor. And that's a very, very important thing. In order to sell the assets of a nonprofit, it has to go through a process through each state's attorney general. And there are general principles, and there's an article I've written about it, but there's also stuff in here. And I just got through actually finishing one representing the seller of assets, actually not a soccer club, it was actually a nonprofit autism organization that was sold to a $450 million for-profit. The assets were sold to a $450 million for-profit company in the healthcare space. But it was a very demanding project, as it should have been, because of the fact that this autism organization was founded as a nonprofit organization. And therefore, you can't just decide one day that your nonprofit is a for-profit. So I talked about those a little last time. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go on to the next slide and talk about a deal when I was representing a for-profit trying to buy a nonprofit. Again, there's an attorney general process. Fair market value has to be paid for the assets of the nonprofit. The proceeds cannot go to a founder. They have to go to the nonprofit purpose. And that means either a foundation set up by that organization, or that organization contributes those assets to another like-minded nonprofit. Those assets were developed, in a nonprofit context. That's not to say that the founders can't move on. They're not wedded to the nonprofit forever. That's not to say that the founders can't be recompensed by the new club, but you can't just decide one day to sell the assets. There are really important hoops to jump through and considerations to be made. Next slide. So another transaction I was involved in, actually, this is was in the hockey space, not in soccer, even though much of what I do is in soccer on the sports side. This is a situation really quite interesting. This was a transaction where we're representing the for-profit entity buying for-profit assets, including hockey rinks and some other assets. So that's not an issue. That's just a traditional deal. It doesn't need, government oversight. But it was buying a club that was technically a for-profit. But in our due diligence, we found out that, well, we knew, but that it was originally a nonprofit. But in our due diligence, we could not trace the proper transfer of assets from the nonprofit to its for-profit establishment of a for-profit. And the lawyers on the other side hemmed and hawed and stammered and said, "What's the big deal?" And we said, "Nothing doing. This gets done the right way." And so that underscores kind of the need for due diligence. And our approach on this. Now, one of the things the lawyers on the other side argued was, "It's all our liability. What are you worried about? We'll indemnify you. If anything ever happens, it's all on us." First of all, I didn't think that was kosher. Second of all, it's not necessarily enough, because if an attorney general comes in and unwinds the transaction, you've lost it. And one thing I want to say about this, what we concluded in this situation, because the conversion, if you will, not really conversion, but the transfer of assets in this hockey club happened maybe 10 years ago. So it was hard to trace. But we ultimately said in one of the negotiation sessions, we had to be stark. And we said, what you did, as far as we can see, is one day at 11:59 p.m., you turned out the lights in your nonprofit, and at 12:01 a.m. the next morning, you turned on a for-profit and the assets were there. I know, for instance, Paul and Seacoast, they were originally a nonprofit. They're a for-profit now, but they did it the right way. They did it in a laborious way. I remember being at one of their events where they had their lawyer describing the whole process. That's the way it's got to be done. So these are really important situations. If you're getting involved in transactions, you need to make sure if there's any past or present nonprofit element to it, you got to make sure that you properly document and handle it legally. All right, can we go to slide 42, please? I want to touch on governance best practices, because that's always an issue for an organization. But that became a huge issue in the pandemic, I think primarily because people wanted to get their houses in order. Just quickly, you guys are organizations, so I'm not going to, there's a lot of stuff in here for you again, in terms of your corporate governance that you can use, but you're all existing organizations, so I'm not going to bore you. You're either a nonprofit corporation. That means you have articles of organization and bylaws. You're either a for-profit corporation where you have articles and bylaws, or you're a for-profit LLC. That's slide 44, Tim, where you have an LLC operating agreement. An LLC operating agreement can be best described as a confluential document. It's sort of articles of organization, bylaws, and members or stockholders agreement built into it. So I've got all this stuff about governance best practices. I'm going to jump to stuff I want to leave you with today here to help you. And I touched on this last year, but in light of COVID, I think it's really as much or even more important to talk about. When you set your organization up, actually, I'm sorry, can you go to 53? Sorry about that. Remember how I started my speech last year? Odd number of directors, really, really important. Why? Because you have a deadlock if you don't have a potential deadlock, if you don't have a odd number of directors. Make sure there's that. Make sure you have disinterested directors in your board. That means people who don't have a financial interest in your doings. You can have some with disclosure, but make sure you have enough disinterested directors. Make sure that you have strong independent directors on the board, no rubber stamp automatically for the DOC. We talked about that last year. Again, unique to youth soccer. Board members who are parents have an inherent conflict of interest. It's not financial, it's not legal, it's worse than that. It's about their kid, and they're worried about if they stand up to the DOC, if they say no, will that affect their kids' playing time? You need to, that's just an issue that's there. You need to get enough people that are willing to be not a rubber stamp. Make sure that board is diverse from the standpoint of skills, so you don't have to hire outside professionals, or rarely at least. Have financial backgrounds, legal backgrounds, marketing and operational backgrounds, and then make sure it's reflective of your membership in terms of ethnicity, race, and gender. Next slide. Again, I want to stick to the time, but and you can go through these. These are kind of self explanatory, but I think it's really essential that the main committees, you have committees of your board. They're essential for independence, for competency, that you have a compensation committee that sets and approves the DOC compensation. There should be no DOC input other than he or she explaining, why they should get a raise, but not in the deliberations. Independently source the data and look at comparable clubs. Modulate it for whether the DOC is full-time or not. Also, that committee approves compensation of other executive directors, and it sets and reviews incentive plans. Next one is nominating and governance committee. That's an essential committee. It sets the board size, leadership and composition. It oversees all board guidelines, deals with all conflicts of interest, which of course in any organization, if there is one it needs to be disclosed, and there needs to be recusal. Recommends candidates for nomination, and it reviews relationships of executives and directors to make sure the director is independent if that person has disclosed him or herself as such. Audit committee is next. Again, these slides are self-explanatory. They are essential, obviously, for risk tolerance and risk profile perspective, to make sure that you're accounting for everything and that your financials are properly audited and the right integrity is there, and that you're complying with all laws, and that committee deals with the auditors. And then whether or not, last slide, whether or not you are a for-profit or a nonprofit, obviously even more important if you're a nonprofit, is you have a development committee. That's for fundraising as a nonprofit in your 501c3 capacity. But also, for your events and your programs and your corporate sponsorships, if you're not lucky enough to have a full-time person like James in your club. Those are four committees I think are essential for good governance. Again, this came up, and I've spent a fair amount of time on this with clubs in the pandemic. My explanation for that is just a lot of clubs decided to get their houses in order. Again, there are 57 slides. There's a lot more here, but I've used up my time. If there are any questions, let me know. If not, I will go back and use my last 10 minutes for something else. Thanks.
Steve, thank you. Always a pleasure. Soccer is such a complex, youth soccer has become such a complex entity from the days when we were all volunteers and ran our little clubs. And it's become, for me, very complex. So I'm sure everybody on this call really appreciates the information that you shared with us today.
Pleasure.
Let's see if we have any questions here.
Why do you have a reasonable term in DOC agreements if you also have an at-will clause? Or do you not include an at-will clause in this type of relationship?
Well, what I'm talking about the DOC agreement. It's a good question. The DOC agreement is a full-on employment agreement. Like I said, 6 to 8 pages. It is not an at-will agreement nominally. So let me just distinguish. Yes, I did say that I recommend so I distinguish at will from without cause. And at will in a normal context means, again, an employee can be terminated for no reason or any reason at all, so long as it is not discriminatory against public policy, right? And there's no mandatory severance. If the employer decides to give severance, the employee can. If there's a handbook that says you get so much for this year, how many years you've been there, whatever, that's a policy. But that's at will. What I'm talking about in the DOC agreement is I recommend that there be a without cause provision within it. So you don't have to have it. Not everybody elects to do that. And I distinguish without cause from at will, because what I am saying is if the DOC, let's be fair, if the DOC has not engaged in a for cause event, and if it's for cause, that person is terminated with no severance at all. But if the relationship has grown stale within the term, let's see, a 3-year term, the club feels it has to move on, it can exercise the without cause provision. But to be fair, there is contractually agreed to severance that comes with it. right? It's a lump sum usually. It's X number of months. So I hope I'm answering the question correctly, but what I'm saying is it's not as simple as at will. It's a presumptive 3 years. It's likely to be 3 years. Um, and again, that DOC is only going to sign it, that agreement, if the DOC believes, hey, if things aren't working out, at least I get this amount. If I'm representing the DOC in that circumstance, then I'm going to say, I'm going to push for as much there as possible, precisely because your question, hey, I have a 3-year agreement, but you have this loophole here. It's got to be a fair loophole. And it's a great question, but again, more and more employers are moving in this direction, but obviously need to be fair to the employee.
Well, Steve, again, thanks so much for being a part of this summit again this year. Hopefully we can all see each other in person next year